This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. While catastrophic weather events like the recent Titli cyclone in eastern India and Hurricane Florence in the U.S. provide concrete images of destruction, the wider context that gives rise to these storms is harder to discern. An effective response to the global phenomenon, like climate change, requires a frame of reference that encompasses more than just environmental science. The reality of climate change weaves together elements of economics, history, culture, and politics on a scale that make it difficult to tell the story and difficult to comprehend. Our guest today, however, has taken on this formidable task with his latest book. Amitav Ghosh was born in Calcutta. He grew up in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Many viewers will know him from his highly acclaimed works of fiction, which have been translated into over 30 languages. His essays have appeared in major U.S. publications, including The New Yorker, The New Republic, and The New York Times. His most recent book is a work of nonfiction. The Great Derangement, Climate Change, and the Unthinkable was awarded the inaugural Utah Award in the Environmental Humanities for 2018. We're also joined by Aneesh Aneesh, professor of Sociology and Global Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where his research and teaching interests include globalization, science and technology, and economic sociology. Well, welcome both of you to International Focus.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure.
Well, I would like to start with a quote, which you've offered in other fora. The climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of imagination. So what does that mean?
Well, in the most basic way, I suppose you could say that the climate crisis is something that's very hard to get our minds around, because it's happening on such a scale across so many places, and it's often hits us with really such devastating effect that it's really very hard to make sense of it. And, in a way, we expect things to be made sense of, not just by ourselves, but by the whole ecosystem that we are in, that is to say writers, intellectuals, painters, if you like. And often climate change is missing from those parts of culture. So
a key concept impacting all of this is that of the Anthropocene. So Aneesh, what do sociologists and others mean by that?
It's interesting, I think the concept emerged from geology as a discipline, and that most of the geological processes are now affected by human activity and requiring so much focus as to call it something that we have added the prefix anthro to it. It's an era, a geological era that's completely affected by human activity.
So on the scale of for fans of Jurassic Park, there was the Jurassic era, and now we're in a new era. So, we've heard from some of your works sort of the limits of the mainstream sort of literary fiction to deal with climate change. So why is that?
Well, for many reasons. One is that climate change happens across. It's a planetary thing. There's been a lot of environmental writing in the past, and fiction is very good at dealing with, particular settings and particular places. But climate change is really a set of connections that extend across the globe. And this is something that's very hard to represent in fiction because, for one thing, we write fiction in one language. When you have so many different languages entering into a phenomenon, it becomes very hard to represent it. Similarly, climate change events are just so extraordinary. I mean, nowadays we read all the time about 100-year events or 500-year events or 1,000-year events, and you don't really expect yourself to be in the middle of a 1,000-year event. And in fiction, if you were to try and present a 1,000-year event as something which is happening in an ordinary way, it just seems improbable. And the whole sort of premise of plausibility that is so important to fiction is sort of becomes untenable at that point.
And to add to it, it's not just fiction. I think the social sciences and even the natural sciences, there is so much functional differentiation between them. So I'm thinking of my own discipline, sociology. It's very hard to talk about climate change because sociology in particular deals with the idea of social well-being, right? And so the idea of human well-being that might have economic well-being, economists might take care of that. Then you have physical well-being, maybe the scientists, the natural scientists might take care of that. So the very notion of human well-being to be thought of from a single vantage point is kind of receding from the horizon. So in my work, for example, I was look at the small labor activity like night work. Night work is we know that because of labor struggles, we have been able to reduce our work hours. But with night work, we don't see any labor resistance. And there is a complete absence while we are diurnal animals, not nocturnal animals. But it doesn't even occur to the social scientists or activists in general. And to me, I think because well-being cannot be thought of anymore from a single vantage point, because for economic well-being, maybe it's providing a job to someone, so it's a good thing. While at the same time, it's a bad thing for the diurnal animal because the chronobiologists will say it really hurts. It gives rise to cancers of all sorts. And as a sociologist, I would say it cuts you off from the daytime larger social life. So I think what Amitav is pointing out is a really strange phenomena that we are, just as our knowledge is growing, we are losing the ability to actually perceive climate change, such a big event, which affects us all. Right?
Yes.
Well, and with regard to sort of the inadequacy, if you will, of sort of mainstream literary work, in one review I saw of your most recent book, the reviewer says, climate change requires an imposition of improbable events on an otherwise realistic narrative. But is that what we're faced with here? It just doesn't seem credible if you're dealing with what is this global phenomenon?
Yeah, I think that's really one of the issues there. That these events just seem so unlikely that they become like science fiction. They become like fantasy. And once they become sort of like fantasy-like, people stop taking it very seriously. They think, this is like aliens coming out of the sky or something, so we won't take it very seriously. But that's the paradox, because climate change is real. We see it happening all around us. I mean, this year, there have just been so many events. Like, I don't know if you saw this earlier this week, on Monday, Italy was hit by the most extraordinary sorts of events, tornadoes, floods, friends were writing to me from there saying that, these things are exactly what you've been saying. I mean, they're just so improbable.
Well, so one of the sort of phenomena of Western literature is just a sort of lack of comfort, if you will, of non-human agency. You can talk a little bit about that. I mean, we tend to concentrate on the interaction of human characters, and the non-human characters are sort of left out of the picture very often.
That's an interesting question, because actually, even if you look at the Western tradition, if you think of the Iliad or the Odyssey, they're both filled with non-human agency, I mean, all sorts of creatures who think and act and speak, and also other sorts of beings, So I would say that this whole business of thinking that agency doesn't exist in non-humans is actually a fairly recent phenomenon, But the curious thing is, of course, that our children's books are filled with non-human agency. So our children grow up reading books in which frogs talk or penguins have thoughts, or so it's not as though we've let it go completely.
So how do we understand that process? That why? Because there's certainly other storytelling traditions where that's very much a part of it.
Very much, absolutely. Well, I suppose it goes back to Descartes and the sort of positions that the philosopher who believed that really animals are like machines, and that human beings have no kind of possibility of communication with animals and with non-humans. But now we know all of that to be untrue in a way. I mean, after all, even anyone who has a dog knows that they're communicating with the dog. I mean, the dog may not speak, but we certainly know that the dog has something that is analogous to thoughts.
So, much of the discussion of climate change often is within those environmental science fora and realms, but there's a lot more to the story than that, is there not? I mean, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's sort of the weaving and intersection of politics and economics, and how does that drive what we're seeing?
Yeah, it's interesting because just as you think of like work week or work hours, they affect the natural scientists too. So what we discuss in the social sciences, in philosophy, or the humanities, they affect natural scientists as well. And just as they affect them, we are also affected by what they discover. So I think, let's say, talk about gravitational field and their discussion of it, we are all affected by it. And that exchange is very important. And so for sociology, for example, we do have, in the social sciences, we do have quite a bit of research, let's say, on the perception of, public perception of climate change and its belief in climate change. And I had a kind of very interesting talk with an Uber driver recently, and he was saying, oh, climate change is just all a hoax, But I said, the car you're driving is developed by the scientific and technological minds and some of the same formulas that are being used to discuss climate change. So how do you decide to believe in these scientists and technologists, but not the other ones? Because there's a complete consensus on the other side as well. And he was flabbergasted. Yeah, he said, that's true, I tend to believe. So I said, if there is a problem with climate science, they themselves will figure it out, because after all the sciences are able to destroy their past understandings. But we, on the other side, have to really trust in their judgment for the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the real paradox. I mean, we live in a society and in a time when, in a way, people worship science. They
Right.
worship technology, they worship science. And yet, when 97% of climate scientists are speaking with one voice about, the urgency of the changes that are going on and the fact that it's largely anthropogenic or man-made, we find ourselves unable to listen. We see now so many climate scientists have really begun to despair of being heard even.
And I think even the 5% that
Not
you
even
mentioned.
5, it's less than 3.
Less than 3, right? And even those, I think you discuss in your book, were influenced by, and they're not really climate scientists, they're influenced by Cold War,
That's
and they
right.
were worried about that.
That's right. And they're sort of like theoretical physicists and
Right.
so on, yeah.
So, of course, one of the big drivers of climate change over centuries now is the carbon economy. So you write a fair amount about that, and actually have an interesting sort of geographical location for that. I mean, there's much more of an emphasis on Asia. Talk a little bit about that part of your work.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean that, whenever people talk about the first oil drill, it's always said to be in Pennsylvania in, I think, 1859. But in fact, in Asia, people have been using oil mud for centuries. I mean, people have been using oil everywhere for centuries, for other things like naphtha. People used to put it on their bodies. Some people also used to burn it. But in China, for example, they used natural gas for centuries, going back to the Middle Ages. They would have tubes in which they carried natural gas. They used it for lighting. They used it for cooking. They used coal also in a fairly large way. But especially oil is very interesting because Burma, Myanmar, which is a country I know fairly well, in Myanmar they had these huge oil fields where oil actually came so close to the surface that it could literally be dug out. And they used to create these wells, and people would go in there and bring it up with either buckets, or sometimes they would pump it up. And this has been going on, since the Middle Ages. And this area known as Yenangyaung is right on the river Irrawaddy. So it was actually an oil exporting port. And for centuries, people would gather around there. So you may remember that in the old days, shell oil, even in my lifetime, was known as Burma Shell.
Well, and speaking of exporting those resources, the history of colonialism certainly impacts this, and where those resources ultimately were deployed and burned. So talk a little bit about the relationship between the colonial experience and those extractive industries.
Well, that's a very interesting thing because, after all, we know that the earliest, the beginnings of the carbon economy are in England during the Industrial Revolution. But what happens then is that the innovations of the Industrial Revolution are very quickly copied. They're copied by Americans, they're copied by Germans, they're copied by Italians, French people. So, human beings copy each other very well. And the same thing happened in India. Indians began to copy the carbon economy very, very quickly, and they were very enthusiastic about it. They wanted to join the carbon economy. But of course, India was then a colony of Britain, and Britain needed India for something else, needed India to produce natural resources, and needed India to be consumers. So they discouraged the emergence of the carbon economy in India. Even in my lifetime, I remember when I was a child, in India, for example, families would cook still with charcoal and firewood and various other kinds of kindling because natural gas, which by then was piped into every home in the West, was not made available to us. So, this had the effect of effectively discouraging the emergence of the carbon economy in India and in other parts of Asia. So, after decolonization, round about 1985, 86, 87, when economies across Asia began to change, they leapt on this bandwagon with triple the enthusiasm,
Well, and consumer behavior has a role to play in this. And I think you've said in some places the climate change is the problem of our desires. So talk a little bit about how that impacts the situation. I mean, an example in your book is, lawns where perhaps lawns shouldn't be grown and all of that attendant requirements and burden on the environment. So Aneesh, what about that? I mean,
I think the lawns are the export of the British, I think, because the lawns, the grass is pretty natural, the meadows in England. And one thing that Amitav actually talks about in his book about the desire is that when we individualize the consumption problems in opposition to climate change, we might be doing disservice because that leads us to the individual behavior issue, and we start asking people, oh, what are you doing for climate change? What kind of car are you driving, right? As if I remember.
Yes, absolutely.
But the problem is that of collective decision, institutional change, much larger, social change in the institutions is required. And yes, we can always change into LED, bulbs and things like that, and people are doing it, as much as they can, particularly in California, as we know in the Bay Area. But I think the effort has to be much bigger and more enormous, and it has to go beyond individual desires, which are, of course, leading to this crisis.
Yeah, it has to be. It's certainly and absolutely a collective action problem because even if we changed all the light bulbs in the world, it would make very little difference. But take the question of the lawn. It's interesting, really, because if you go around the world today, if you go to Abu Dhabi, for example, which is in the desert, they spend their oil in actually desalinating water from the sea in order to produce this water, which they then use to create these lawns in the middle of a desert, where 2 generations ago their grandparents would never have thought of doing that.
It's an interesting process. I mean, how does that desire to have a lawn come to be?
Exactly. And why should it be such a desire, say, in Arizona? In Phoenix or in other water-stressed areas where really these things are not supportable. It's a desire really that comes from culture. You've read Jane Austen or something, and you think it looks beautiful, so then you want to have it. And those are the ways in which I think culture has to change.
And when it comes to lawns, there's an exceptional city we have in the U.S., which is Santa Fe, and I happen to live there for a year. They do not allow lawns. And you have beautiful, gravel and other things, but the natural vegetation grows everywhere. So they have addressed their desertification problem very differently, and that could be an example for the rest of us.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so we should move on before we part ways to remediation and a possible way forward. And there's an interesting comparison between 2 documents that ostensibly address this issue, and that is the 2015 Paris Agreement and Pope Francis's Laudato Si encyclical. And so talk a little bit about those 2 different approaches.
Well, in my book, I actually do a comparison of the 2 documents, and it's actually really interesting because you would expect that Pope Francis's document would be more kind of mystical and so on, and that the climate agreement would be actually very straightforward and so on. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Laudato Si is written in this absolutely crystalline language, and is written in a form which is just trying to reach out to people and to show people that you have to think about this. Whereas the Paris Agreement is written in complete bureaucratese and in a kind of rhetoric which is meant to just close off the subject. And that's very striking to me. It seems to me, I must say that I think Laudato Si is the single most important thing that's been written on climate change.
Well, and there's a interesting quote I will share. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. So I think, how does that play into a possible solution?
Well, I think in a sense, the moment we use the word nature, we are already seeing a separation between ourselves and everything that's around us. We have to start realizing that really, we are creatures in the world, we are animals. Not only are we animals, we are habitats of other animals. A large part of our body weight consists of bacteria and parasites and so on. So nature is not something out there. Nature is us.
And so what does the discipline of sociology have to offer in this return of the collective?
I think I was thinking about Amitav's book too, that we have to think not in terms just of technological solutions to the problem. We may have to think of reduction and renunciation. And I think some of this document, the Pope's document, suggests that it's more than a technological issue. So we may have to change, and as a sociologist and as a novelist, we have to think about bringing about some changes in culture itself. Right?
I couldn't agree more. You're absolutely right. I think that's exactly it. And we have to think of, changing how we live. And that is really the fundamental problem. Nobody wants to change how they live.
Well, and along the way, as we're working it all out, does the language of religion, the language of the mystical somehow provide a better approach to explaining this phenomenon?
I certainly think it does. I mean, I don't think, of course, there are some preachers and religious figures who encourage you to consume. But on the whole, I would say that most religious figures in every religion encourage you not to be so materialistic. They try to make you think that, consumerism isn't life. There's more to life than that.
Well, so if you were predicting, can these processes take place on a global scale? How does that sort of consciousness get raised?
I would say that we have reached a point now when certain very important consequences are unavoidable. But at the same time, now it's a question of worse or less bad, And of course, we must all work towards making an outcome that's not as bad as it might be.
Amitav Ghosh, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you
Aneesh
very much.
Aneesh.
Thank you.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.